Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our CPAESS Discovery Seminar Series. My name is Cindy Bruhier, and I am the SPS CPAESS Center Deputy Director. My position gives me the pleasure of working with all our postdocs and postdoctoral fellows, like our speaker today. I'm delighted to have you attend our CPAESS Discover Seminar Series. Our CPAESS scientists do everything from explore ocean depths, fly into hurricanes, model the corona mass ejections, and those that unravel the mysteries of the Arctic. And we love to share their science with the public, NCAR, UCAR communities, and our many colleagues at universities and agencies across the globe. Just to orientate you today, we are using Slido so that you can pose questions to our speaker, and you can pose these questions throughout the talk. You will be able to find access to the tab at the top left of the screen. Today, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Taylor Graham. Taylor is a former CPAESS postdoctoral researcher, and he worked alongside our colleagues at the NOAA GFDL lab. In this capacity, he worked on evaluating the methods for translating coarse-resolution climate models into actionable data forecast on the question, what methods are fit for purpose? Prior to that, Taylor received his PhD from Portland State University, where he focused on atmospheric circulation, climate change, and wildlife. Today, Taylor will speak on the role of observational data in local climate projection uncertainty. Over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Cindy, for the introduction. So I'll be talking about this concept of observation-based data in local projection uncertainty. I have a screen over here, so if I'm looking over and not directly at you all, that's why. So I want to start by thanking everyone who helped out on this and sort of mentored this project. People at GFDL, Keith Dixon, Lee Chung Sun, Nicole Zenes, and my colleagues at UCAR and NCAR. And this work was also funded by the ESTCP program, which is a DoD program about resilience. So let me just dive right in here. I'll start my timer as well. So this work is focused on something we all think about a lot, is how do we translate our science into usable data? We have scientists, as Cindy talked about, sort of trying to unravel the basic mysteries of the Earth. And then there are people who need to use data to make decisions, especially about climate change and planning for long-term climate change as well as extreme weather. So that's what this work is focused on. If you are someone who is in charge of making decisions for a city or a state or a military base, you need local information. Information that's relevant to your area. And one of the disconnects there is that the tools, the sort of state-of-the-art tools that we have for projecting change in the climate often aren't designed with local scales in mind. They sort of can't be at the moment. This is something I'll talk a little bit about more. They're designed for global scales. So if you're someone who's in charge of making these decisions and you go and you find a map of global temperature, how do you translate that into how many cooling centers you need to open and how that will change in 30 years? What's your extreme precipitation going to be in your watershed and how that might change? Something like that. So this is the sort of disconnect of how there's this global climate modeling system and then we need local information. So if you're tasked with climate adaptation, what do? That's kind of the motivating framework for a lot of this work. And to explain a little more about the tools that are used here, for scientists, here in the audience, this will be pretty familiar, but to set the stage, why this sort of raw global climate model data isn't enough. If you are someone who is charged with making a decision based on data, and these decisions are being made. So this is sort of an urgent question, putting yourself in the shoes there of someone who is in charge of that kind of thing. But to explain a little bit, the Earth system models, global climate models, they're physics-based simulations of the Earth, the ocean, the atmosphere, the cryosphere, all the spheres, and they use the numerical equations, fluid dynamics, and relationships between physical quantities to project changes into the future, as well as simulate our current climate. But there are things that are not sort of built in directly, because either the grid scale is too coarse, which is necessitated by how extremely computationally intensive these are. You can't run a simulation for every single meter on the Earth. You need to sort of choose boxes. So the boxes that are chosen for these global climate models are often on the scale of 50 to 100 to 200 kilometers wide. So you can imagine that that sort of smooths over a lot of local climatology if there's effects of water or topography or something like that. Um, so if you need local information, you can't use these output of these models directly, or they seem too coarse, and you want higher resolution information. Another issue is that, while they often have sort of correct forcing, correct climate change signals, there's sort of a range of how accurate these models are in simulating the historical climate. Um, you might have a model that gets the correct precipitation location for an area, but if you're experienced with that area, you know that, oh, it's, this climate model is a little too wet or it's too dry. So the raw output of these models often needs to be sort of corrected a little bit, with the idea being that if we get them right in the past, which we can actually measure against, then they'll be right in the future. We can't measure a climate model against the future because it doesn't happen. So the only thing we really have to evaluate against is stuff that's already happened, weather, climate that's already happened. So the approach for correcting these issues where you need this local climate data, or one approach rather, is bias correction and downscaling. And this is a large field, and a field that's emerged over the past decades of translating this global climate data into local information that people can act on better. The idea of bias correction is taking that raw climate model output data and aligning its historical values with something you've actually measured or close to being measured, like the distribution of temperature or the likelihood of precipitation or something like that. There are a whole bunch of bias correction methods. I'm not going to go into every single concept of how it works, but the idea is being you sort of take the distribution simulated by the climate model and make it match the historical data, and then apply sort of a similar concept to future data. So you've corrected the future data. So you have a projection that has been shifted a little bit according to how its bias was in the historical data, and the idea being that's more correct. And this bias correction has to use some sort of reference data. You can use observations. I call them OBS. People call them OBS sometimes. Observations like from an actual weather station. But that's just a point. That's a single point. If you have the output of a climate model, which is on a grid, it's a continuous map, you need some sort of grid to correct it to. And that's where something that's called often observation-based data, observation-based gridded data, is a term that we use sometimes is used. And people who are familiar with this, these ideas, or not ideas, examples are things like PRISM or GridMet, PRISM and GridMet, pretty similar ideas, and ClimGrid, which is a NOAA product, LIVNA. These are some data sets that are used a lot here. And often when we see sort of continuous maps, like if there's a map of total annual precipitation over the United States. And it's nicely colored and gradients and has all the mountains. This is often one of these observation-based products that are sort of created by taking stations and using a combination of physical laws like lapse rates and an interpolation to create continuous data. So that's what's used often to correct this climate model output. And then you have this concept of downscaling. Downscaling is taking the coarse grids and turning it into high resolution data. There are a lot of methods to do this. They're often separated into two different types, which are either statistical downscaling, which means often taking the relationship between the large scale patterns simulated by a climate model or historical weather and local data, and then applying that to all data. So if you know this is the large scale weather pattern is associated with this fine scale data, you find a statistical relationship, then you can apply that to other data and create sort of high resolution data where maybe you translate your climate model, which is on grids of 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers, into data that's 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. And there are a lot of methods to do that. Another method is dynamical downscaling, which is instead of using this sort of empirical relationship, you actually run sort of higher resolution physical based models nested within your larger model. There's almost a philosophical debate about which of these methods you want to use, and that's not really what I'm getting into here. I'm mostly focused on talking about statistical downscaling. One advantage of it, or why it's often used in place of dynamical downscaling, which is theoretically more physically correct, is that it's quicker to run, it's less computationally expensive, so you can create high resolution data sets a little easier. And this data is being used. So there's a practical component to this analysis. And here's an example of what I'm talking about, just to sort of visualize this. So what we're looking at here on the left, these are maps of Washington State, the northwest corner of the US. Let me go back to this global or this CONUS map here. There you can see that northwest corner there, just to the upper left of that magnifying glass. Zooming in there, focusing in on Washington State, an interesting area of a lot of complex topography and sort of microclimates. So on the left, we have a historical simulation by climate models of the average DJF winter, December, January, February, mean minimum temperature. So you can see that this resolution of these climate models can be quite coarse. It varies across the models. Each one of those is the model for 4 of them. With this one, CAN-ESM5 being a very coarse model. So you have so much going on in a single grid cell. So this is what you want to translate into higher resolution data. So on the right is the same data, DJF minimum temperature, but it's been through one of 3 different statistical downscaling methods, STAR-ESDM, LOCA2, and BCSDD. I'll define those more later and talk about them. But you can the point is you can see how this coarse resolution data has been translated into this high resolution data, which creates these sort of really beautiful maps. You can see, comparing it to this terrain map from Google down there, how you can see the mountains and effects of water, this sort of gradient of temperature radiating out from water, the cold mountains. So if you were just sort of handed this map, it looks extremely realistic and nice. And you can also see the sort of range of differences in the products there. This is the same models that have been averaged, but it creates some differences, and there's different resolution there. So downscaling produces this high resolution data, and this data is used. This is just a number of studies I pulled up just by searching downscaled GCMs on Google Scholar. It's not only used directly, but as sort of input to impact models. Like if you have a hydrology model or a disease model or an extreme rainfall model, you need high resolution data to feed into that, and then you write a paper about it or make decisions about it. So here, I found these papers on climate change and malaria, or flood disaster, extreme precipitation, flood resilience, that are all using the output often of a NASA data set, BCSDD. So this isn't a theoretical discussion of, well, let's a priori say which one is best. People are already using these, and making decisions on them. So figuring out if there's a best choice is sort of a pretty important task, I think. And then I want to talk about the uncertainty that people know about and uncertainty people don't necessarily know about. This is a framework on the left that Keith Dixon, who was someone I worked with a lot at GFDL, sort of came up with. So I've taken something from one of his slides here on the left, and reappropriated it for this. So thank you, Keith. I think there's pretty common knowledge about certain types of uncertainty in climate projections among the, I don't know, let's call it the stakeholder community, people who are using this data, but who aren't necessarily like really steeped in the literature. Someone who's trying to make decisions about climate resilience. This concept of scenario uncertainty is well known. The difference between high emissions and low emissions will change a lot. It'll create a lot of uncertainty of the projections. And this is something that this famous paper from Hawkins and Sutton sort of visualized here, of these different types of uncertainties and how they change over time. And scenario uncertainty is well known. Model uncertainty, your choice of climate model, will create a lot of sort of divergence. One might say changes will be a lot warmer. One will say changes will be a lot drier versus wetter. This is sort of well known. And I think increasingly people are aware of natural variability, internal variability. People who are in the field, of course, know these very well. But I mean, even among sort of non-climate scientists, people who we're doing this science for, really, I think are becoming more aware of this idea of internal variability, that the climate system is a pretty chaotic system. So a single model that says this is the future might be sort of one of many possible futures in the roll of the dice. So we have techniques for sort of testing the range of possibilities all under the same forcing. So I think these are sort of commonly appreciated uncertainties. There are less commonly appreciated uncertainties, which is what this work is kind of concerned with. This output of this high resolution data, it looks great. It is high resolution, it's really pretty, but the choice of which downscaling method you use, which high resolution data set that's built on the same climate model, creates uncertainty as well. And there have been some good papers about that recently, talking about how the choice of downscaling data set will change your projections. It might even reverse your projections with the same climate model. One might say things are going to get drier, and one might say things are going to get wetter. And so this is something that I think needs to be appreciated more by people who are using the data. And I don't mean to point out, say, like they don't understand, why don't they understand? But it's our job to communicate this, people who are sort of analyzing the data. And I think this is something that people who create this data do really well, in their technical notes and stuff, technical notes and papers. But I think there's still room for improvement, of sort of improving the pipeline from upstream science to downstream data use, of communicating, well, what are the limitations of the data here? And that's what I'm going to be talking about more with my very long intro. Okay, so you're in the shoes of someone making decisions. Now you've been told you need to appreciate all this uncertainty. Great. And you need to go and choose a data set because your city needs to do some climate resilience projects. about rainfall or floods or heat, what do you choose? There is an increasing number of these data sets to choose from. This is a plot from Sam Hartke's paper published this year in Environmental Research Letters, which is sort of about this issue. People should go look it up, Hartke et al. This is the data sets that she analyzed, but I thought it was a good illustration of this is just a subset of the possibility data sets to choose from. These are methods of downscaling. They all have sort of dense acronyms, but the point is that there are 10, 15 more data sets to choose from that all give high resolution climate projections. And there's not necessarily a huge amount of guidance on which one is fit for what purpose. If you were interested in changing flood risk in the US Southeast, the data set that performs the best might be different than someone who is interested in extreme humid heat in New York City or rain on snow events in California. And there are all these different data sets to choose from. So that's sort of the issue. To summarize the background and motivation here, these high resolution data sets that provide climate change projections are out there. They are publicly available. People can download these, and they do. And there is a strong demand for it. Before I started this postdoc, I was talking to people at a consulting company, and they were doing these sort of large climate resilience projects of building seawalls and stuff like that. And they were talking about sort of hiring climate scientists, and they asked me, how do we get projections of precipitation at a 1 kilometer scale? That's what we need. So we want this information, and if we as scientists don't provide it, someone else will, and they do. There are private companies that create these downscaled data sets and sell them and make strong promises of how accurate they are. But I think the idea of this project is sort of to take a step back and provide some guidance on what methods are sort of fit for what purpose here. So the results I'm going to be talking about today is a kind of case study of what I just talked about. Basically, choose a climate variable in an area that we think is interesting. I chose the area around the Puget Sound in Washington, and look at the simulation of historical temperature and temperature-based thresholds using these different data sets, a subset of downscaled and bias-corrected data sets, and do some sort of kind of exploratory analysis of where do they agree, do they disagree, why do they disagree, and out of that, can we provide some guidance towards people who might be using this data, and can we create some information to help people who might use this data. The artwork on these slides is from the most recent National Climate Assessment. They had I think it was like sort of user submitted artwork, I think from students of climate in their region. And so on slides where I didn't have a figure, I thought that was really nice. I'm gonna take a drink of water here before I get into the results. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to be focusing on this subset of the US. I showed this on a larger map earlier. This is the northwest corner of the contiguous US, Washington state. It's sort of the western half of the state. And it was an interesting region to focus on. You have to draw a box somewhere here. But it was interesting because of the sort of complex topography, which creates cool microclimates and sharp temperature gradients. So from a physical perspective, it was pretty interesting to study. And then from an infrastructure perspective, there are a lot of people who live here, and there's a lot of infrastructure. And so it's sort of, ripe for giving guidance for climate adaptation. So this is a map of the domain. We have these two mountain ranges, the Olympic Mountains closer to the Pacific Ocean, and then the Cascade Mountains on the sort of cutting through the middle of the state. And then this lowland region around the Puget Sound, which is heavily moderated in temperature by that water. And then, so I'm going to be talking about this domain as a whole, but also talking about this smaller subset shown there. And these markings are weather stations. They are climate grade weather stations, meaning they have been sort of tested for continuity of location, continuity of data, and they've been recording for at least 30 years. So these are at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, which is marked as C, Tacoma Narrows Airport, which is TIW. You don't have to memorize all of these. TCM and GRF are on the Joint Base Lewis McChord. It's a U.S. military base. They're about 10 kilometers away from each other. And then Olympia Airport, which is farther inland. So this is where I'm going to be talking about and mostly focused on for the next few slides. And to go over just the sort of technical aspects of the data, I talked a lot about how there are these huge amounts of downscaled climate model data sets to choose from. We had to choose a subset of them. Some of it was confined by data availability, and also just what is out there and what people use. So for the downscaling methods, downscaling data sets that we used STAR-ESDM, which is at a resolution of 1/24th of a degree. It's about 4 or 5 kilometers per grid box. So that's pretty high resolution compared to 50 or 200 kilometers of a climate model. LOCA 2. Oh, I should STAR. Oh, I'm always terrible with these acronyms. Well, it's in the paper. Catherine Hayhoe at I think Texas A&M or Texas State. I think Texas A&M. But the meaning of the acronym is in there. LOCA 2, which is locally constructed analogs. It's a method for taking this sort of what is the large scale weather system and relating it to the local data, and then that's how they downscale the climate model. That's probably, yeah, you should read the paper if you want details on this. And then this NASA data set, NEX-GDDP CMIP6, which I refer to as BCSDD going forward, which is bias correction and spatial disaggregation daily. So one of the reasons of choosing all these three data sets is STAR and LOCA are used in the National Climate Assessment. They are the downscaling method used in this national document that was created, which is like our version of the IPCC document, and it's sort of the state of climate science in the US. So these are actively used data sets, and the NASA data set is it has global data, so it's used in a lot of studies outside of the US. And in general, these downscaling data sets are not produced globally. So something that's produced globally is going to have a lot of impact there. And then we have 3 or 4 observation-based gridded data sets that we use. I mentioned that this bias correction and downscaling is trained on data, observation or observation-based data. So these are the data sets it's trained on. STAR is trained on this data set and ClimGrid, which is produced by NOAA. LOCA 2 is trained on the LIVNA data set, and NEX-GDDP CMIP6 is trained on this data set. GMFD, Global Meteorological Forcing data set. Again, you don't have to memorize what all of these mean. When I get into the results more, it'll make sense, I think, in context more. And then for station data, we use this network of NOAA stations, ISD Light, which are considered climate grade. You can do climate analysis on them. And then we use 16 CMIP6 models for the analysis. The same CMIP6 models, which were used in the National Climate Assessment. So to show a little bit more about the data we're using in our domain, this is the representation of winter minimum temperature on the top and summer maximum temperature on the bottom in these gridded data sets. So these are the observation-based data sets. The general idea being that they take recorded weather station data and then create continuous data between those stations using a combination of physical relationships and sort of interpolation. They all use different methods, but they create this like really beautiful high resolution data that is sort of treated as observations. It's not a simulation. It is based on what was actually recorded. So this is also used as sort of input to these often impact models like hydrology or disease models or something like that. So you can see it captures all the topography and sort of coastal gradients. But you see there are some differences between them, like and Klimgrid and Livna in the mountains. Livna is quite a bit colder, and that the importance of that I think I'll talk about more later. And there is some resolution difference in between them as well. And Klimgrid is 1/24th of a degree. That's about 5 kilometers, I think. Livna is 1/16th of a degree. I think that's about 9 kilometers. So you might wonder whether higher resolution works better or not. We can talk about that more later. So I'm starting with sort of maybe one of the main points as opposed to building up to it. What I did was look at weather stations. This is that zoomed in map around the Puget Sound with those 5 weather stations that are actually recording, and then compared it to the observation-based data sets that are used as training data for this high resolution data. And remember, those observation-based data sets are on the scale of about 5 kilometers. So they have many grid cells between all of these stations. So if one were looking at a map here of that smooth data, it would be pretty reasonable to assume it's capturing things correctly. But what we find is that in this area where there are these pretty steep temperature gradients because of the water and topography, some quantities in this observation-based data are quite different than the actual station recorded data. So I'm focusing on frost days here, which is days below 0. This was an interesting target, I thought. It has infrastructure implications, things like road maintenance, as well as flooding, because it would control sort of when rain transitions to snow. And this area gets is sort of on the border of that's a big climate change question, I think, for the Western mountains, is sort of the height of rain versus snow and how that'll impact snow and water resources. So turning to the box plot on the right, what we have here separated by the dashed lines are the different station locations. And we have the number of annual days below 0 recorded by the actual weather station at the top. And this is over 30 years. So that's the box plot. You have the mean or the median value in the middle, and then the quantiles, and then the outliers. So to give an example, focusing on this top plot, TCM, which is at that Air Force base, the median frost days recorded at the actual station was about 60. All of the gridded data sets at that grid cell, which is at about a scale of 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers. So it's it's sort of as close, almost as close to a point data you can get, are about 50% too low there. There's this sort of very large bias there. And this is something we see in general at many of these station locations, is that either the observation-based data is very biased in this quantity. It's too warm or too cold, or there's sort of this big range between these data sets that you might think would be quite similar. So a kind of takeaway from this is, well, your observation based isn't necessarily the same as observations. This is something that the data developers who build these observation-based data sets know very well, and they write about it. And in the sort of user guides, this is warned about. But I don't necessarily know if this is something that someone who is not steeped in this literature, but uses this data, is necessarily aware of. That if you're in these areas of steep temperature gradients, you have to be very careful in using any sort of data that's been sort of smoothed, like this observation-based data. So moving on to sort of why is this? Why does this happen? We did this experiment to test how similar the time series of temperature are at stations. So again, we're looking at the station data here, recorded observation data, and we looked at temperature anomaly time series over 30 years. So what is just the day-to-day variation of winter temperature? And how similar is that time series at any given station to this one station TCM, which is at the Air Force Base there. So you see those numbers are the correlation coefficients. So the station that is about 15 kilometers away, Gray Army Air Force Base, GRF, very highly correlated, very similar day-to-day weather variation in temperature. They're sort of in the same little microclimate. But you go not that far away, maybe 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers to Tacoma Narrows, TIW, and your correlation drops to 0.83 because this weather station TIW is very close to the water, so its day-to-day temperature is affected by sort of different factors. Even though it's in a really small area, there are these steep temperature gradients and microclimates, such that in this pretty small domain, the actual recorded temperatures are quite different. And so if you have a gridded observation-based data set that is really high resolution and kind of looks like it captures these, you might be kind of fooled into thinking that your resolution is higher than it actually is. So we repeated this experiment, but instead of using stations, we used the grid cell of the observation-based data set and all other grid cells. So that's what we're looking at down on the bottom, where it is the correlation coefficient of the time series at the TCM grid cell versus all others. So remember, we can see that on the actual station data at the top, the correlation drops to 0.83, not very far away at Tacoma Narrows. But then if we go down and look at these observation-based data sets, the correlation is almost 100% out to like 80 kilometers. So this is kind of the effective resolution of that data. You can see the underlying smoothing here, that these fine scale temperature gradients, which are within the nominal grid spacing of the observation-based data, are actually not captured by the observation-based data. Again, this isn't an error in how this data is built. This is necessitated by the lack of station data and something that the data developers are sort of well aware of. But it's something that I think should be communicated well, that resolution doesn't necessarily mean local realism. There is underlying smoothing in this data. So how does this impact climate projections? Well, it impacts it because, as I said, these downscaled climate models are trained on that observation-based data. So the output of the downscaled climate model, you can see, is quite high resolution. It produces this really fine scale data where, going back to that question I asked in the very first slide of, let's say you're in charge of managing climate adaptation for a city, you can go and download these data sets and they will have a grid cell that is for your city. And you might think, I can use that because it's so accurate, it's so local. But this downscaling method is inheriting data from the observation-based data set, which is inherently smoothed. So this high resolution can be kind of deceptive because the downscale GCMs are inheriting characteristics from the observation-based gridded data sets they're used from. I should say, they don't have to be from observation-based data. The downscaling method could be trained on anything. It could be trained on a station and you just get a time series. I should have explained, we have a downscaling method that is sort of the algorithms and system of doing this, and then the output product, which is the actual data set produced, which is the combination of the algorithms and methods and the training data and the model data. So to talk a little bit more about how this affects climate in our climate models, I want to show this historical simulation first. There's a lot here, so I'll sort of talk about what to focus on here a little bit. Broadly, we're looking at time series of frost days again, days below zero, and looking at it in a number of different data sets. On the top, row A there, we're looking at the time series of frost days at 3 different weather stations and 4 different of these observation-based data sets at those same locations. So the black is the weather stations. What we can see is that the observation-based data sets can have a range. They can be much too low or too high in Olympia, or get it right at Seattle. And this isn't necessarily apparent, like if you were just using this data, where they get it right and where they're off a little bit. And so moving down to row B, what we're looking at here is again the station data in black and the observation-based data set LIVNA in the solid green line. So we can see that there's a divergence between the station and the observation-based data set. And then we also have the ensemble mean of 16 climate models that have been downscaled using that LIVNA data set as its reference data, producing this LOCA2 data set there in the dashed line. And we can see it follows the observation-based data set, and the ensemble range, this envelope around it, is sort of around that data set. So this range of climate models in the historical period is inheriting these biases from its observation-based data set and can differ quite a bit from stations. And to point out another interesting thing here, if we look at row C, in the middle column and third column, we actually have this downscaling method that is trained both on its observation-based data set and ClimGrid and on station data, which is shown in blue. And comparing the blue dashed line to the orange dashed line in row C for Olympia, we can see that the downscaling method that's trained on the station actually matches the station data. That sounds kind of intuitive. One might expect that, but just to sort of show it, there's this large difference at Olympia between the station-based data or the station data and the gridded observation-based data. And this difference does not happen at Seattle, which sort of implies that the gridded observation-based data might have incorporated that Seattle station. So this is how these biases can impact the historical simulation. What if you're interested in climate change? That's what we're looking at here. This is the time series, the multi-model mean of 16 models that have been downscaled using these 3 different methods, and then looking at the grid cells at different locations. And this is looking at frost days. So broadly, the takeaway is they're pretty different projections at the same location. Looking at, for example, Olympia, the middle column here, we see this sort of signal that's inherited from the GCM, this warming signal. So we see a strong decrease in frost days kind of to be expected. But depending on which downscaled data set you use that is from the same model, you get very different answers. Like if you look at 2050, do you have 20 frost days or 40 frost days? I mean, that's 100% difference. And um, that difference can be because of the downscaling method, but also the training data set. At Olympia, we have STAR that is trained on the gridded observation-based data set. Say you have 20 frost days at 2050 on average. And then that same downscaling method that's trained on the station says actually 40 days because it's based on the actual observed climate as opposed to this sort of more smooth observation-based climate. So that's a pretty big difference. And this is just looking at frost days. But you can imagine how this could be very impactful for a number of different variables. If you get 100% differences just based on the biases in your observation-based data set in locations where there are these strong temperature gradients. So I think this was sort of a really interesting finding, just changing the sort of whether you're training a downscaling methods on stations versus the station-based data has really large impacts on local climate change projections. And I should say this STAR method that's trained on the station was provided to us directly from the developers. So we thank them for that very much. So moving to some more like spatial analysis, one of the findings we found was that the underlying GCM structure tends to dominate the climate change signal, even in this really high resolution data. So what we're looking at here is the change in average winter temperature, Tmin. And on the upper left, we have 4 GCMs. I just selected these 4 out of the subset because they have a range of resolutions. So you can see some of them are really coarse, some of them are higher resolution. And then in the other plots, we have the same data, change in winter minimum temperature under a high emission scenario, but using that downscaled data sets. And the highest resolution data, STAR, and the lowest resolution downscaling method, the NASA one, basically look pretty similar to the GCM. So despite the fact that they're so much finer scale information, they're inheriting the warming signal just from the GCM, which is kind of by design. We want for statistical downscaling, we want the GCM to be driving the signal, but it might be surprising, I think, to someone using this data to look at this and see, well, this data resolution is supposed to be at 1/16 of a degree or 1/24 of a degree. Why is it just this super broad warming pattern? So high resolution can have sort of hidden smoothing, I think is the point here when you're using these statistical methods. Or it can look pretty different, like LOCA 2, which has a different method. So it has this heterogeneity in the warming signal there, which as far as I can tell, doesn't necessarily correspond to a physical understanding. So you need to evaluate which one of these is best here. Yeah. And then my final slide of results is, again, talking about this sort of spatial uncertainty. Your choice of downscaling data set is a major source of projection uncertainty. And what this is demonstrating here, what these plots are showing, is the difference between the minimum and maximum signal across data sets. So, for example, looking at this winter minimum temperature here on the upper left, I looked at for every grid cell, which data set, STAR, LOCA 2, or NEX-GDDP, CMIP6, has what is the maximum warming and what is the minimum warming, and what is the difference between those signals for every grid cell. And that gives an uncertainty of what is the range given by your choice of data set. So for temperature, it can be up to 1 degree Celsius, which compared to global warming at the end of the century isn't massive, but it's pretty big and would be pretty impactful for things like snow melt in the mountains or rain on snow, which is where those uncertainties lie. And then if we look at frost days there in the bottom left, the uncertainty can be up to 50 frost days in these mountain areas. This range of projections given by the choice of downscaled data set is pretty huge. And I think the uncertainty there is in part created by the choice of training data set. So this observation-based data set is then sort of propagating throughout the climate projections and creating this really large range of uncertainty there, which is something that one would need to be aware of. If you're in charge of making these decisions, how do you choose? There is this source of uncertainty. Okay, so I've gone through most of my results. I don't know if I've answered the question of how do you choose so much as maybe confused people more. I've said, look, you have to be aware that your choice has all this hidden uncertainty. But I think there are some principles that we can get from these results. And the first one is one that data developers have been talking about for a long time, is that resolution does not equal realism. Just because a data set is extremely high resolution doesn't necessarily mean it's capturing local effects. It might be built on sort of physical laws and interpolation. So if you're using these data sets, whether it's these observation-based historical data sets or climate change projections, you need to be aware of your local climate and microclimates, especially near coasts, mountains, anywhere with steep temperature gradients. Be really careful there and understand your limitations before using the data limitations. So those would come out to sort of our recommendations to data users here. Identify any sort of strong microclimates if you're trying to do climate analysis in a really local area. You can't just sort of plug and play the data. You need to understand how these uncertainties might arise. And I would compare things with direct station observations if you were doing things at a really local scale. These gridded data sets are great for sort of larger areas. And use consistent baselines for climate change projections. Make sure sort of your historical and your future match. So you get the GCM signal, but you're not accidentally comparing it to an incorrect baseline because whatever data set you used is incorrect. And whenever possible, use multiple products. And I also want to, again, emphasize that the idea of this work isn't to sort of like throw these data sets under the bus because they're all really great. And the developers are like aware of all of this, but to try to translate this to information that maybe people who use this data but don't read all the tech notes and papers because that's not their job, information that they can use. So that concludes this talk. Thank you to all the people who helped out down at the bottom left there. And if you want to email me, there is my email. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your work with us, Graham. This was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed listening to it. We are moving over to our Q&A portion of the seminar, so I would like you all to look at the top left hand, and you would find the tab up there to add your questions. There should also pretty soon appear a QR code on the screen that you can also use for questions. And while you are typing your questions, I would like to invite you to check out our website. It is CPAESS at UCAR.CPAESS for all our upcoming seminars. Our next scheduled seminar is Wednesday, November 19th, 2025 at 11 o'clock Mountain Time. And that seminar will be given by Dr. Yao-Wei Li, one of our Climate and Global Change Postdoctoral Fellows. This talk would also be available on our CPAESS YouTube channel. So look at the YouTube channel for this talk as well as our past talks. And with that, let's move over to the question part of today.
We have a question from Holly Alvarez. What is the time period you studied when comparing station data to observational product output? Box plot slide is what she's referencing. Apologies if I missed it.
Sure. I don't know if you missed it. I might not have mentioned it or written it. That was a 30-year historical period. So that was 1985 through 2014, um, which was, yeah, when the stations had pretty complete data. And yeah, so 30-year recent historical time period.
Thank you. We also have a follow-up question. Why do you think the Seattle station's results are better correlated than the output from the other stations?
Better correlated. I suppose that there, just to clarify, there are two things I sort of talked about here. The downscaled models at Seattle aligned better with the stations, as well as the observation-based data set. The grid cell at Seattle aligned quite well with the stations compared to other locations. Um, One theory of why that might be would be that in building that observation-based data set, um, that whichever one I was shown there, the data developers used the Seattle weather station, um, or it was weighted higher than like the Olympia weather station. So maybe the data located at Olympia and the gridded data got smoothed over more. Um, that's one theory. But then if you're talking about um, why there was also the actual correlations where I looked at the time series, where Seattle was a little more correlated with the inland station than Tacoma Narrows. Um, I'm not entirely sure. Tacoma Narrows, I think, was a little closer to the water um, than SeaTac Station. I mean, they're both all really close to the water, but I think Tacoma Narrows is sort of surrounded by water. So maybe it has a bigger difference in sort of day-to-day weather or what day-to-day temperature compared to SeaTac, which is maybe only has water on one side. Um, so I hope those, I'm not sure which one of those you were asking about, but I hope that answers.
Thanks, Graham. We also have a question from Martha. What improvement approaches do you think should be pursued next?
Improvement, I suppose, for um, the downscaling methods. Um, I'm not entirely sure about like building what would improve the building of them. I think the I think a big question that people have is sort of, well, what's the added value of more downscaling? Do we need, machine learning based downscaling or really high resolution? Um, so I think what the premise of this project is maybe that the best improvement for the use of this data is now figuring out what the best uses are of what we already have. Like that would be the best use of energy versus um, more data sets or sort of higher resolution data sets. Um, or at least that's one idea. I don't want to I don't want to offend data developers. I don't build the downscaling myself. So um, all their work is really great.
Excellent. I think we have one. Oh, here we go. This is from Jonathan. Very nice seminar and study. Could you please comment on some of the factors practitioners should consider when considering precipitation projections?
Yeah, I mean, precipitation is in some ways quite a bit trickier than temperature. So that's the next step of this project. I'm still working on this, um, and hopefully looking at some extreme precipitation. Um, I think something that I would emphasize people should be aware of, and I talked about this in my, commonly appreciated scenario or uncertainties, so people are a little aware of it, is the internal variability of precipitation can be much higher than the signal, and also models disagree on precipitation more. So if you're looking at what is the climate change signal of precipitation for your area, um, looking at a large range of models and large range of scenarios and internal variability. There are resources on this. I'm not saying you need to go and do the climate analysis yourself if you're like a water manager, but being aware of precipitation can be quite chaotic on sort of a multi-decadal timescale. It isn't necessarily as linear as temperature, is something that practitioners are aware of, but that would be the main thing I would emphasize.
Looks like we have one more question. Great talk. Thanks, Graham. How do you communicate these uncertainties in local data to decision makers?
Good question. I think that, well, at least for this um, project, the idea is it's been a project that I joined sort of halfway through. So there have been all the sort of names I listed or people who've been working on it for a while. And the idea would be to create a report at the end, that would be given to the funding, the stakeholders who are interested in this. How, in a larger sense, I'm not totally sure. Um, it's like the problem of Zeno's paradox, where so I talked about, okay, we have this upstream climate science, and now we have people who use data, and we need to close this gap. And okay, I'm saying I'm doing that. I'm creating this guidance. Oh, but now there's a gap between the creation of this guidance and the communication. So I'm not really sure how to do that. I'd really like to learn more about working directly with stakeholders, because I talked about communicating upstream science, but in reality, this is still kind of upstream science. So how do you create those relationships? I know there are people at NCAR who are doing that, definitely. So I wish I knew more.
Great. That looks like the last of our questions. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks again, Graham, for the great talk. Really appreciated it. Just a quick reminder, everybody, our future talks are on CPAESS UCAR.edu, and you'll find this talk as well as our past talks at our website and our YouTube channel. I also want to take a moment to thank Fletcher Ryan, our UCAR Multimedia Service, as well as our CPAESS communication team that has assisted in the background. We cannot do this without your quiet work in the background. So thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us, and please join us in November for our next one. Good afternoon.